When the war ended, the world went looking for monsters. They searched the forests of Bavaria, the rubble of Berlin, the mountain bunkers and secret tunnels of the Third Reich. But in many cases, the monsters had already vanished. What the Allies found were their wives, their mothers, their mistresses, women who sat quietly at dinner tables where genocide was discussed, like a business plan. Women who raised children while their husbands orchestrated mass murder. Women who said, "I didn't know." But what if they did? What if they weren't bystanders at all, but accomplices? They smiled, they dined, they raised children. But what else did they do? Magda Goebbels kissed her children goodnight, then fed them cyanide. Eva Braun lived in Hitler's private villa, then followed him into death. Ilse Hess visited her husband every weekend in prison, still believing in his cause. And one woman kept souvenirs in her attic, made from human skin. They were called housewives, but history calls them something else entirely. If your husband oversaw the deaths of millions, and you knew, and you stayed, are you still innocent? Today we uncover the untold stories of the women behind the worst crimes in history, not to relive horror, but to understand how ordinary people become complicit in evil. This is not fiction, this is history, and it's far darker than we were ever taught. They were not innocent. In fact, many of these women were among the most unrepentant and cold-blooded individuals of the entire Nazi regime. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't stand behind podiums. But they stood behind the men who did, and often they stood with them willingly. These were not women who simply didn't know. They were women who chose not to know, or worse, chose to support. Some joined the Nazi Party years before their husbands did. Others raised their children on tales of racial purity and German supremacy. They sipped champagne at SS banquets. They hosted garden parties just miles from where people were being tortured and gassed. And when the bombs fell, many of them didn't run from the regime. They clung to it. Take Magda Goebbels, the so-called First Lady of the Reich. On the surface, she was elegant, poised, a model German mother. She smiled in public appearances beside Hitler, dressed her children in perfect Aryan fashion, and championed Nazi ideals with unwavering pride. But when the war turned and the 1,000-year Reich began to collapse, Magda made a choice, not to run, not to survive, but to kill. She poisoned all 6 of her children, blonde, angelic, innocent, because she believed they couldn't live in a world without National Socialism. Then she followed her husband into death. A murder-suicide she called a mercy, or Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's closest men. She didn't just believe in the regime, she was raised in it, a Nazi from girlhood. When Berlin fell, she disguised herself as a children's home director, smuggled some of her own kids as orphans, and fled. She didn't run because she regretted what had happened. She ran because she wanted to survive the world her ideology had helped create. And then there was Ilse Hess, loyal beyond logic. Her husband Rudolf flew a doomed solo mission to Britain in a delusional attempt to negotiate peace. He was imprisoned for life. And Ilse? She visited him every week for decades, still believing he was a man of peace, still defending the same twisted ideals. She didn't denounce the Reich. She mourned its loss. Some of these women lived long after the war, decades even. And during all that time, very few expressed any public remorse. Some wrote books defending their husbands. Some became icons in far-right circles. Some vanished into quiet retirement, taking their secrets and their silence to the grave. But even silence is a choice, and silence, when wrapped around evil, is complicity. They were not helpless. They were not clueless. They were not mere accessories to history. They were participants, and yet their stories were often sanitized, forgotten, or painted with pity. They were just wives, the narrative went. They didn't really know. But history, real, unflinching history, tells a different story. These women stood next to evil, looked it in the eyes, and did nothing. Or worse, they smiled. She wasn't a soldier. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't hold a rifle or stand at the gates of a concentration camp. But what she did may have been even more chilling. Her name was Magda Goebbels, and to many in Hitler's inner circle, she was known as the Mother of the Reich. Elegant, educated, composed, the perfect embodiment of the Nazi woman, at least in the propaganda. She was tall, graceful, poised. Her blonde children, 6 of them, were photographed constantly, their Aryan features displayed in Nazi magazines as the model German family. But behind the manicured smiles and the porcelain portraits was a conviction so deep, so unwavering, that it defied reason. And in the end, it defied even motherhood itself. Magda wasn't just married to Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda. She was one of the regime's loudest supporters. Her devotion wasn't second-hand. It wasn't silent. She believed in the cause, in the ideology, in the man. She met Hitler often. He was even best man at her wedding. Some said she was infatuated with him. Others said she viewed him as a messiah. But what defined her wasn't who she loved. It was what she chose to do when that love collapsed with the fall of Berlin. As the Red Army closed in and the walls of the Third Reich crumbled, Magda had options. She could have fled. She could have surrendered. She could have tried to save her children. She did none of those things. Instead, on May the 1st, 1945, deep within the Führer bunker, she prepared her children for sleep, gave them warm milk, brushed their hair, kissed them. Then, with the help of an SS doctor, she sedated each of them one by one with morphine. And when they were unconscious, she placed a capsule of poison between their lips. One by one, they slipped away. 6 children, the youngest just 4 years old. Magda Goebbels called it an act of mercy. She believed a world without National Socialism was not a world her children should grow up in. That without Hitler, life itself was not worth living. Some say she was brainwashed. Others say she was loyal to the very end. But the photographs remain of 6 children smiling, of a mother brushing her daughter's hair just hours before ending her life. And we are left to ask, what kind of belief makes a mother do this? How does ideology become stronger than the love for your own children? And when we tell the story of Nazi Germany, why do we so often forget her name? She wasn't just a wife. She wasn't just a mother. She was a true believer. And in the darkest moment of the 20th century, that belief became fatal. Magda Goebbels may have gone down in history as the most chilling example of ideological devotion, but she was not alone. There were others, women who didn't die in bunkers, who didn't kill their children, but who, in quieter ways, helped the Reich survive long after its physical destruction. The next woman didn't take her own life. She didn't stand before a tribunal. She didn't face justice, but her legacy may be just as disturbing. Her name was Gerda Bormann, and if Magda Goebbels was the mother of the Reich, then Gerda was its keeper of secrets. She was married to Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's closest aides, the man who controlled access to the Führer himself. And Gerda wasn't some passive spouse. She grew up in a family steeped in Nazi ideology. Her father was an early member of the party. Her childhood was filled with rallies, red banners, and the hum of speeches about racial destiny. When she married Bormann, it wasn't just a marriage of love, it was a marriage of mission. Gerda believed in the cause as fiercely as he did. She raised their 9 children according to the principles of National Socialism. She wrote to her husband about racial purity, about the duty of German women, about loyalty to the fatherland. When the Reich began to fall, Gerda didn't waver. She didn't denounce. She didn't run to the Allies, begging for forgiveness. She went underground, disguised herself, pretended to be the director of a children's home, hid some of her own children as orphans. She moved quietly across the collapsing borders of a ruined empire, protected by those who still clung to the dream of Hitler's Germany. While others wept or confessed, Gerda stayed composed, calculating. She carried documents, she buried files, she moved money. By the time the Allies caught up to her in Italy, she was already dying. Ovarian cancer. She died under British watch, in a hospital bed, still holding on to a past that had turned to ash. Her last months weren't marked by reflection or regret. No one ever heard her apologize. Just like her husband, her loyalty remained intact until the very end. And in the silence of her final days, surrounded by her children, we are once again left with the same question. How deep does belief go? Deeper than fear? Deeper than pain? Deeper than death? For some of these women, the answer was yes. They didn't just support their husbands. They embodied the Reich. They carried it long after the uniforms were burned and the swastikas torn down. Not all monsters wear armbands. Some wear pearls, some carry babies, some whisper lullabies in languages that preach hatred. But their choices echo just the same. And their silence, perhaps, is the loudest legacy of all. Lina Heydrich never wore the black uniform of the SS, but she admired it. Fiercely, she was the wife of Reinhard Heydrich, often called the Butcher of Prague, and the man who helped architect the final solution. And while the world remembers his crimes, few know how deeply Lina believed in him, and everything he stood for. They met when she was just a teenager, already obsessed with Nazi ideals. Her brother introduced her to Hitler's movement. From that moment on, she was hooked. She saw the Third Reich not as a regime, but as a rebirth, a righteous crusade. Lina pushed her husband into the SS. She encouraged his ambition. She cheered his rise. And after his assassination by Czech resistance fighters in 1942, she didn't mourn quietly. She didn't disappear. She defended him for decades. She gave interviews, wrote books, claimed his actions were a tragic necessity. She called him a patriot, a martyr, a misunderstood leader. Lina never apologized, never questioned. She didn't just stand by her husband. She carried his legacy. And in doing so, she reminded us that even after the guns fall silent, ideology does not die easily. Then there was Emmy Goering, the glamorous actress turned First Lady of the Third Reich. She married Hermann Goering, Hitler's second-in-command and founder of the Gestapo. Emmy lived in splendor, adored by the press, smiling for the cameras. But behind the velvet gowns and theatrical charm was a woman who benefited immensely from the Nazi regime and chose to overlook its crimes. She claimed she wasn't political, that she didn't know. But she lived in castles looted from Jews, wore diamonds that once belonged to deported families, sat beside Goering at state dinners while others were starving. After the war, she was arrested, tried, sentenced to just 1 year in prison and banned from the stage for 5. She later published a book, My Life with Goering, where she painted herself as a misunderstood victim of circumstance. But silence is rarely innocent, and luxury built on suffering is never apolitical. And then, of course, there was Eva Braun, the woman who stayed with Hitler until the very end. She wasn't loud, she wasn't political, at least not on the surface. But she knew. She lived in the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. She dined with Himmler, laughed with Goebbels, took photographs of SS officers lounging in the sun. She saw the machinery of death from the inside, and she chose to stay. In the final days of the war, when Hitler's empire crumbled around them, Eva had a choice. She could have fled. She could have saved herself. Instead, she married him, one day before their death. And then, together, they took poison. Eva Braun didn't give speeches. She didn't carry orders. But she chose love over morality, loyalty over life, silence over truth. And in that silence, she became complicit. And then there were the quiet ones, Ilse Hess and Margaret Himmler, 2 women who outlived the Reich, outlasted the trials, and stepped back into the world not with confessions, but with silence. Ilse Hess stood by her husband, Rudolf, even when the Nazi regime labeled him a traitor. She defended his bizarre solo flight to Britain, insisted he was misunderstood, and after his life sentence at Nuremberg, visited him in prison for decades. She never spoke against the regime, never condemned its crimes. Instead, she lived a long, quiet life in the Bavarian Alps, publishing letters that painted her husband as a man of peace, even as history remembered him otherwise. Margaret Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler, the man who designed the machinery of mass murder, chose another form of denial. She claimed she knew nothing, that she was merely a housewife, but the Allied interrogators weren't so sure. She lived in luxury, reaped the benefits of her husband's position, and raised their daughter in the shadow of the SS. Though never convicted of any crime, she lost her pension, her civil rights, and perhaps a chance to ever tell the truth. She remained composed, silent, and loyal to the end. These women did not pull triggers, but they upheld the men who did, and in their refusal to speak out, during or after, they preserved the very myths that the Reich was built upon. Each of these women walked a different path. Some killed, some lied, some vanished. But all of them, through action or apathy, helped the Reich survive, in spirit, far beyond 1945. Some did it for love, some for power, some for belief. But in the end, their choices ask us to confront a deeper question. What does it take to stand beside evil and never speak? And how do we remember those who did? Not as footnotes, not as wives, but as witnesses, and sometimes willing participants. Do we dismiss them as tragedies of a bygone era? Or do we let them speak, uncomfortably, honestly, to something deeper inside us? Because the truth is, evil does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles across candle-lit dinners. Sometimes it rocks a child to sleep. These women remind us of that. They weren't monsters in the classic sense, but they stood close to monstrosity and didn't look away. Some cheered it on, some rationalized it, some chose silence, and in doing so, they shaped history, not just through action, but through inaction, through complicity, through the comfort of choosing not to see. It's easy to call them villains. It's harder to admit that they were human. Because if they were human, then their choices weren't impossible. And if their choices weren't impossible, what does that say about us? Would we have done any different? Would we have spoken out, resisted, walked away? Or would we too have chosen comfort over courage, safety over truth? That's what these stories ask us to confront. Not just what happened, but how it happened, and why. Because it didn't take an army of tyrants to build the Third Reich. It took households, neighbors, classrooms, dinner tables, and yes, wives. So as we remember these women, not just as wives, but as agents of belief, of silence, of preservation, let us not forget what their legacy warns us, that sometimes the most dangerous things is to do nothing at all. And sometimes the people who say the least leave behind the loudest echoes. But what happened after the war ended, after the swastikas were torn down, after the photographs of Hitler were burned, after the camps were liberated? What did these women become? Some were tried, a few were jailed, most were released, and many simply went home. Ilse Hess opened a guest house in the Bavarian Alps, welcoming hikers and travelers into a quiet world far from barbed wire and guard towers. She lived to 95, never once renounced the Reich. Her letters to her husband, published after the war, spoke not of remorse, but of romanticism. She called him a man of peace. Margaret Himmler moved in with her sister and faded from public view. She claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, despite living in wealth created by the man who oversaw it. When her daughter Gudrun began attending SS reunions and defending her father's legacy, Margaret said nothing. Silence once again became her sanctuary. And perhaps that is what should disturb us most, that those who stood closest to evil could walk away from it, rebuild lives, rewrite memory, and sometimes even be believed. But history is not kind to forgetfulness. It waits, it listens, and it brings stories like these back to the surface, so we may learn and never repeat. Because this story isn't just about the women of the past. It's about the choices we make today. In a world that still struggles with silence, with complicity, with comfort at the cost of truth. So if you're still watching, still listening, ask yourself, when injustice surrounds you, will you speak? When the world turns its head, will you look? And when history asks where you stood, what will you say? Because history remembers the loud, but it never forgets the silent. These women didn't need to carry guns or wear uniforms to leave a mark. They shaped history through their presence, their proximity, and their refusal to disrupt the horror around them. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy not of leadership, but of complicity. Let that legacy be a warning. That comfort can corrupt. That silence is never neutral. And that belief, when unchallenged, can destroy more than bullets ever could. If you found value in this story, don't let it end here. Share it, reflect on it, talk about it with someone. Because remembering isn't just for historians, it's for all of us. History doesn't ask us to change the past. It asks us to do better with the present. And it begins by refusing to look away.